Welcome to Coffee with Kish. Today on Coffee with Kish, we're going to talk about the P word, polygamy. If there's one thing that sets Mormons apart from other American religious groups, it's the P word, polygamy. In fact, Mormons are infamous for the practice of polygamy. And what that means in a Mormon context is one man marrying many women. 2 women, 3 women, dozens of women in some cases. Now, officially, the church, the LDS Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, turned its back on polygamy in the year 1890. By the publication of Official Declaration Number 1, which is found in LDS Scriptures, which put a stop to the practice of polygamy. And the practice was really stopped because the Mormon Church, the LDS Church, had its back against the wall. The government was coming after them. They were going to disenfranchise the church and make it impossible for the organization to run, to have enough funding if they kept up the practice of polygamy. So, when ex-Mormons, post-Mormons, anti-Mormons focus on polygamy, they're usually focusing on one thing. They're focusing on the sex, the big S word, sex. Because for them, and understandably from my point of view, they think, Mormon polygamy is about sex. Because if there's one thing that really drags the reputation of Mormons down in the United States, I would say it's the ghost of polygamy. Where did polygamy begin? It began with Joseph Smith. And I know, this is the craziest thing to me, as someone who's descended from polygamists. That's right, my ancestors practiced polygamy. In fact, one of my ancestors was an important witness to the original revelation on polygamy. Okay, so, I'm connected to polygamy. I'm a product of polygamy. Well, it was my great-great-grandfather on my mother's side who had 4 wives, and I think I'm descended from a child of the 3rd wife. I'm a descendant of polygamous ancestors. And I have to say, when I hear this recent claim, and you have people like Michelle Stone, who's gotten this really huge following online, claiming that Joseph Smith didn't practice polygamy, and instead it was something that Brigham Young cooked up. Brigham Young, big bad Brigham Young, he cooked up, perverting the true gospel as restored by Joseph Smith. I'm sorry, the evidence is decidedly against this idea that this was something Brigham Young cooked up. Instead, the evidence shows quite clearly, and was proven all the way back in the late 19th century in Utah, to the satisfaction of Emma Smith's sons, that, Dad, Joseph Smith Jr., he practiced polygamy, guys. He received a revelation that's currently found in the LDS book of Scripture called the Doctrine and Covenants, section 132. Joseph Smith received a revelation that authorized polygamy from God. And that's what they believed. Now, what's my personal position on polygamy? I'm not a fan. Let me just put it that way. I'm not a fan at all. I'm not against people who, consenting adults, following their own religious principles, practicing polygamy. I think it's a bad idea. I think it's no way to run a society. I think when you look at fundamentalist communities and the young boys that are thrown out because they might be competition for some old geezer who wants wife number 5. You got to think, well, there's a demographic issue here, guys. There's not such a difference in the number of men and women in the community that you can afford to have some people, too many people, maybe having many spouses and others having none at all. It's a recipe for disaster, social disaster. So I don't really think much of polygamy. I'm sorry if that offends you, if you're a polygamist. You don't have to care what I think. I'm fine with you thinking that I'm up in the night, that I don't understand the restoration or what have you, but I have to follow the dictates of my own conscience, in the famous words of Joseph Smith. Follow the dictates of my own conscience and say polygamy is not for me. And that's okay. I'm pretty sure it's okay with my spouse too. We're agreed on that, and that's what's important. But to pretend or convince myself or insist that against the evidence Joseph Smith didn't practice polygamy, that he didn't receive Section 132, well, my ancestor, David Fulmer, he attested to the fact that that revelation was received by Joseph Smith, and Hiram Smith, the prophet's brother, showed it to him. And what am I supposed to think? That there's some huge conspiracy theory to cook this all up just for the benefit of Brigham Young? I don't think so. I'm not a fan of Brigham Young. He's not my favorite guy. He left my ancestors to freeze in their handcart company while he took care of his whiskey, made sure that got to Deseret, the territory of Deseret, cozy and comfy, while my ancestor was freezing and starving in the snow. I'm not a huge fan. But let's not give credit where credit is not due. It's not his fault. But, he does kind of own it in a way, because he took the reins of power, and here we're getting to the subject of the new movie that's come out from the Interpreter Foundation, 6 Days in August. Big plug for the movie right here. Go see 6 Days in August. Interpreter Foundation spent lots of money making this movie, and it's a pretty good production, so I hear. Unfortunately, it's not playing in my area. But it's all about Brigham Young seizing control of the church on behalf of the apostles as caretakers. See, Brigham Young didn't actually type himself Joseph Smith's successor at the time. No, he was going to be with his fellow members of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. They were going to be caretakers of the church, and they felt it was deeply important that they do this so that they could protect the practice of polygamy, which they were already engaged in because Joseph Smith had them do it. He invited them to practice polygamy. He invited them to get witnesses of its divine truth, to practice the principle, plural marriage, polygamy, all the P's, PPP, polygamy, plural marriage, principle. And they did. And so Joseph Smith didn't want Emma, who hated polygamy, to take over the church. No, he didn't want other people who didn't believe in polygamy to take over the church. Where he was adamant that he and the other 12, especially those who were practicing the principle, who had received their temple endowments, their second anointings, that they would be the ones who would keep the practice safe, keep it going, because for them, that was the true fullness. It was the fullness of the priesthood, and you had to do it, or else you wouldn't obtain exaltation, you wouldn't become a god in the next life. So they felt it was very important. So I had a kind of a contentious little conversation on my favorite board, discussmormonism.com. It was in response to my Coffee with Kish episode on Mormon deification. You remember that one? I think it was episode 29. I'll go check that afterward. So I made this episode, and I get this smart aleck who comes on to DM me. He goes, well, you know what deification's really about? It's really about dangling a prize to get or manipulate young women into the practice of polygamy, because really all Joseph Smith wanted was sex. I'm like, what? Okay, yeah. I mean, I get it, right? I mean, that certainly has an appeal to it, right? It seems kind of intuitively like if you think Joseph Smith's a bad guy and a con artist and a manipulator and abuser, and I know a lot of my viewers do, okay? And that's okay with me. You're entitled to your opinion. I'm not here to push Mormonism on you. I'm not here to apologize for Joseph Smith or try to whitewash his career. It's not up to me. That's not what this channel's about. That's not what I'm about. At the same time, I'm not here to, target Joseph Smith and say that he was the worst thing ever so that you leave the LDS Church. Because again, that's not what I'm about. This is about geeking out on the topic of Mormonism. And for me, geeking out is understanding it. I mean, yeah, it's different. It's not the culture that I know, and it's not the way I choose to live. But I want to know what it is on its own terms. I don't just want to say, well, because I don't attend the LDS Church anymore, because I don't affiliate with that religion, I want to make sure others know how evil it is and make sure that they don't make that mistake too. Because, I mean, come on. It's a lot more complicated than that. It's a lot more complicated than that because, mainstream members of the LDS Church in good standing are not practicing polygamy. All right, so you don't have to worry about what Joseph Smith and Brigham Young were doing because the practice was stopped. So if you were to join the LDS Church today, nobody's going to come up to you as a member in good standing, acting correctly, who's going to say, "Oh, baby, come on and be my second wife. I just want to sleep with you, so come be my second wife." Yeah, you might get some doofus or, crazy person who does that because he's just a doofus or a crazy person, but he's not doing it because that's what the LDS Church does today. What I'm interested in was why they were doing what they were doing. And I think people today, for their own faith or non-faith reasons, are going to say, oh, this is the reason why it was done. It's all about sex. It was all about being a cult leader. No, he didn't do it at all. I mean, don't look at all the evidence. Don't look at all the evidence. He didn't do it. It's all a lie. It's all a conspiracy against Joseph Smith, who was innocent and perfect in every way. And if he weren't, then I couldn't continue to have faith in the LDS Church. So by golly. And I'm sorry if I'm making fun of you. I'm sorry. I find it baffling. Honestly, I do. I find it baffling. I don't think it has anything necessarily to do with being a member of the LDS Church or not. It's just freaking baffling to me that with all the evidence out there that Joseph Smith started polygamy in the LDS Church, in the Mormon Church, that you would insist that he couldn't have, or else you're going to lose your testimony. Well, I'm sorry, guys. He did it. And to everything there is a season, I guess. It's not the season for polygamy now. Thank goodness for you people who choose to be LDS. I wouldn't want to have to see you guys go through all that horrible mess that is polygamy. Now, maybe the occasional one of you has made it work out for yourselves as fundamentalists, and that's your jam, as it were, and I'm not against that. I mean, that's the way you want to live your life. Who am I to say otherwise? But not me, not this guy, no polygamy. But let me also say this. I mean, for those people who are ex-Mormon or anti-Mormon, and you're saying, oh, he did it for the sex. Now, I wouldn't want to be Brian Hales, who also drives me up the wall, who says, oh, it couldn't be for sex. It has nothing to do with sex. In fact, I don't even think that these wives had sex with Joseph Smith. They were just, spirit wives that were just sealed according to the priesthood, and they actually never consummated a real marriage. I'm sorry, but the evidence is against that. You have women who attest to the fact that they lived with Joseph Smith when they had access to him as a full married couple with sexual relations and the whole 9 yards. So, sorry, Brian Hales. You're a wonderful guy. I know you intend well. I don't know if you still stick to this perspective, but last time I checked in, that was your point of view, and I'm just not buying it. Honestly, just not buying it. So many bizarre, convoluted gymnastics to avoid historical fact, to avoid evidence. Joseph Smith started polygamy in the LDS Church. You could say he received a revelation from God, or you could just say he started the practice. I don't care, but he started the practice. But did he do it just for the sex? I'm sorry, but, he had no trouble having sex. He obviously had sex. He didn't need to marry people to have sex. And in his position, he could have easily had sex. And if he were this person who's completely amoral, just doing whatever the heck he wants, then he might have done that. And we have these crude ideas about these charismatic religious leaders, and we just have this type of the cult leader who's a con artist, who's manipulating people, who's evil, who does everything just because they're trying to satisfy their own personal urges. And I know that that's a good way of staying out of a charismatic religious group if that's what you think is going on. And it's not like I'm against that. I don't really have any particular personal need to see people join these cults. But you're not going to learn what makes these things tick by just satisfying yourself with this horribilizing view of what the cult leader is. Because not all these guys are the same. They don't all believe the same things. They don't all do the same things exactly for the same reasons. And I think the devil's in the details. Joseph Smith could have engaged in other practices that would have satisfied his sexual urges. Instead, he chooses to marry these people and have multiple wives, and then have his followers, his male followers, marry in a polygamous relationships just because. It doesn't make sense. And if you read Doctrine and Covenants, section 132, it seems to have been the case that if you wanted to obtain the fullness of blessings, exaltation, and the whole Megillah, then you had to practice this plural marriage. And it was consistent, I think, in his mind, with this idea of the restoration. Because for Joseph Smith, in the last day, you would have a restoration of all things. Well, he looks in his Bible, and he sees that kings of Israel had multiple wives and concubines. And you look in section 132, and he's asking this question, was this a sin? Why were they doing this? And, God answers, and he says, well, no, it's not necessarily a sin, but I didn't exactly like the way they were doing it. But this is an eternal principle, plural marriage. And, if you enter into this covenant and you live righteously, then you will be exalted, and you will people worlds in the hereafter, joining in the great creation project of your Heavenly Father and the other deities. Remember, Mormonism is not strictly monotheistic. It's rather something akin to henotheistic, meaning Mormons believe in the existence of many gods, of which you worship one. It's even a little bit more complicated than that, but I don't want to get into the weeds on that during a polygamy discussion. So, no, it's not just about sex. He could have been unfaithful without having all those entanglements. I would say that Joseph Smith was unfaithful to Emma because he lied about polygamy. He slept with young women who worked for him in his household as maids. He married all of these other women, some of whom were already married to other men. And it's messy. It's messy, and I don't like it. I don't approve of it. I don't stand by it. I don't stand up for it. I don't believe in it. I'm not saying others aren't free to do as they will, but it's just not for me. But it's also not just about sex. I think it's really powerful for people to say, oh, it has to be about sex because Joseph Smith was a con artist, a manipulator, he was a monster, he was a fraud. And so in order to make that our argument as powerfully as they can, they're not going to worry so much about the details of why he practiced polygamy. In fact, they don't care. So I don't make my historical decisions that way. I'm a professional historian. That's what I do. I'm not a Mormon historian. I'm not claiming to be a Mormon historian. As a professional historian with a Mormon background, even though I don't practice polygamy, I don't want to practice polygamy, I don't approve of polygamy, I still want to understand what it was that my ancestors were doing, my polygamous ancestors. So, my grandfather on my mother's side spent his young years in Canada. Why? Because his grandfather spent time in prison for polygamy, and they fled to Canada so they wouldn't be harassed by the U.S. government over their polygamy. So this is my family history. It's the family history of a lot of other people. And, like my father's wife, for example. I told her once that I thought polygamy was a mistake, and she felt I was wrong because she's not ready to repudiate the practice of polygamy as something that wasn't divine. I don't really have a problem doing so, honestly. 'Cause I don't know. I mean, it may have had a purpose in its place, but it was executed poorly, led to a lot of disastrous things, cost Joseph Smith his life, I would argue, caused immense suffering in families that tried to live the principle, in families that, in innocent children that were impacted by polygamous marriages. So I don't really have any desire to protect it, excuse it, or anything of the sort, but I don't see what we learn if we either pretend that the evidence isn't the evidence, or we try to make something out of it that it wasn't actually in fact. I mean, I think Joseph Smith did take his religious ideas seriously, and he followed through on them, because if he was just interested in being a thief, if he was just interested in being a con man, if he was just interested in being a philanderer, there were a hell of a lot of easier ways to go about these things. But, even if it's kind of twisted, if you want to say it's kind of twisted the way he did his religious life, I think that religion was a serious part of it. It was. And it probably is for other charismatic religious leaders that we don't like. But I don't think we get to understand what it is that they're about, and we don't have a good way of preventing bad ones from doing damage if we oversimplify, if we're reductive. We may be happy to distance ourselves from this stuff by just, shaking our fists and calling this stuff evil. I was pretty happy that on this thread on discussmormonism.com that there were other people who could see that this was more than just about Joseph Smith going out to have sex. Because there's some smart people there. There are people there who like to use their brains and exercise their minds. Really, I think everybody who posts there, even the person who was criticizing me, is going there with the intention of exploring and learning sometimes through arguing and disagreeing. which I think is great. I love these boards. I don't like it that people say, oh, you shouldn't visit these places. Well, if it's not for you, don't do it. That's fine with me. But I'm sure glad that there are places like this where people can come and disagree with me like this guy disagreed with me. Now, I was heated with him. I said, nerds to you, buddy. I don't agree with your thinking. I think it's wrong. I think this is kind of a boring approach to a complicated history. He accused me of being an LDS apologist because as soon as you don't take the party line on how Joseph Smith was bad in these particular ways, then you must be an apologist. In fact, he compared me to Daniel C. Peterson. Now, I should be flattered by that. I mean, to be compared to the crown prince of apologists. Well, I must be doing something right in doing things all wrong, according to this fellow. Anyway, well, that's my little rant about polygamy, about following the evidence with polygamy. I'm not into polygamy denialism or conspiracy theories. I'm not into reductive thinking that says, oh, it's all about sex. It's a complicated problem. It's not a complicated problem that I wrestle with because I want to justify polygamy. No, for me, it's a complicated problem to understand this rich history of the evolution of the Mormon faith. So this is Coffee with Kish. Please like and subscribe. Please comment below if you think I'm up in the night or if you like what you see. It'd be great to hear from you. Take care.